Actually, have you gone live yet?
I just did, because you said you were okay with that. So yeah, welcome. It's Tuesday. We have another round of reviews. Today we want to focus on this one here, but we are still waiting for someone, so we just pick something easy now. The networking team asked me to skip this one because that's one I had before. This one is for Thursday, so I guess this one is the next one then. Is that easy, Stephen, or doesn't? I guess it might be easy.
Yeah, it's easy API wise. We just need to decide if we want to do it. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, totally.
Cool. So in some ways, this builds off of what we approved last time for the UTF-8 span formatable stuff. So we have the ability today to we have string interpolation, right? You can interpolate into strings, and with all the string handler work that was added in .NET 6, we can use the string interpolation syntax to write into other things. So we added support for, append and append format with a string builder, or append and append line with a string builder using interpolated strings. We also added the ability to write directly into spans. So you can say span.try_write and give it an interpolated string, and it'll be formatting directly into the span of char that you gave it. And it's an extension method, memory extensions.try_write. That's obviously for UTF-16 for span of char. This proposal is basically do the exact same thing, but for UTF-8. So having a memory extensions.try_write overload that takes a span of bytes and formats, rather than as UTF-16, formats as UTF-8. It's the APIs are the only ones that really matter for people are the ones that are the extension methods themselves, and then you have the handler that is what the compiler generates code to. It is effectively identical to the one for chars, with the exception that anywhere you saw a span of char, now there's a span of bytes. And then I also added you can't pass today. You can't pass spans as generic. So if you want to be able to format a span as the arguments for one of the holes to fill in, you need a dedicated overload for that. So because we want to allow you to put read-only span of chars inside of a hole for an interpolated string, we have append formatted that takes a read-only span of char. We want to allow that for UTF-8 as well. So this has adds overloads for append formatted that take a read-only span of byte. So you could use U8 or things like that inside of holes. Otherwise, it's the same thing. And as implementation detail, the reason I said it's related to what we did before is just like the span of char one looks for ispan formatable and will use its implementation if it has one, this will also look for UTF-8 span formatable so that it can ask the type being formatted to fill its bytes directly into the span of byte.
I mean, that would make sense to me. Like, one question I have is just looking at the APIs. So did we mark the other ones as scoped already, or is this a breaking change, marking something as scoped? Probably not, right?
It's not breaking to mark it as scoped. I don't remember right. I thought I just copy and pasted from what's already there.
Okay, cool. Then,
but it's possible I didn't. I'm just forgetting. But no, it's fine to mark it as scoped. All scoped is saying is the API is promising its caller that it's not going to store a reference to it. Right. So it's not breaking to add scoped. It could be breaking to remove scoped.
Interesting. And then you marked one API as if the C# compiler supports interpolation with U8 literals. Do we know the answer to that already or no?
There's currently no plans for it. It could also be added later. But the idea is basically, right now the compiler generates for all the constant portions of an interpolated string, it calls append literal with a string constant. And you can imagine if it ever supported U8, interpolated string syntax with U8s, that rather than generating strings for those portions, it would generate read-only span of bytes for those portions, in which case we could use append literal with a read-only span of byte. As it currently stands, unless we do some sort of magic in the JIT, all those constant portions will end up still needing to be encoded at runtime, which is less than ideal.
Yeah, I was about to say that if we had that feature, presumably you wouldn't want people to do that, right? Because you would say, like, at that point, please add the U8 suffix to that string, right?
Right. Ideally, for formatting with UTF-8, you'd upgrade to using the U8 there. I could imagine us, we need to talk to Igor, whomever, figuring out how challenging it would be in the JIT, but basically treating encoding.utf8.get string effectively, or get bytes effectively as a JIT constant, or a JIT intrinsic rather. You could imagine the JIT doing something magic inside of a pen literal based on a constant string coming in. It could effectively synthesize the constant version of that as bytes, but that's probably non-trivial work.
Right.
Am I missing an API, or does this make it easier to write UTF-8 interpolated strings to a span of byte than just like normal strings, where you'd have to go through the encoder? Like, do we just have like normal write methods that take a string and, or like append?
Sorry, I'm not understanding the question, Stefan.
Yeah, so like the question is like these methods, right? Like target a span of byte and write interpolated strings. And like I'm looking in like ASP.NET code at our like UTF-8 text writer and stuff, and we go through like encoding UTF-8 APIs and so forth. Like I'm just wondering, like
this does all that for you. So like,
right,
if you wanted to, if you wanted to compose, the various segments together rather than having to do encoding.utf8, get bytes and then slice and do the next thing. This is kind of doing that composition for you, just like the existing memory extensions .try_write does that composition for you today with a span of char.
Yeah, I was looking at those. So my question was like, is there a gap? Like, so if I'm trying to write a non-interpolated string to a span of byte,
that's
like
try copy too.
Because
do you mean like
use a UTF-8 string?
You mean a UTF? Do you mean a UTF-16 string to a span of byte?
Yeah. Because like you can use the encoding APIs, but like this seems easier.
You could just have an interpolated string that's entirely a single hole that is the string, or you can call encoding.utf8.getBytes.
Right, I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. Like, it's almost tempting to do like the whole interpolated string just because it's like less lines of code. Is there a gap there?
Is it really less lines of code? It's a single call.
I was looking at the UTF-8 text writer, and we make it more complicated than it needs to be, but we do some things at least to make it fast. I guess it's encoder.convert. But you got to new up the encoder. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I can say I don't like the line that shows in the API usage, because aside from the variable name, nothing there says this is writing UTF-8. So this is just writing a string into a byte buffer, and so I'm gonna rattle the bars again and say that UTF-8 should be in the method name.
I don't know how you would do that, because the thing is that the way the interpolation would work is that it's just the pattern for the compiler, and there is no difference between UTF-8 and UTF-16, right?
Right, but if we name the method try_write UTF-8, the compiler doesn't care what the target method's called. It cares that it's decorated with the right attributes.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Because we have one string builder, we have one string handler per encoding. Yes, we could do that.
And then to Stefan's point, if we thought that we needed the same level of, I have a interpolated string syntax that I need to write UTF-16 into a buffer, we could decide to add try_write UTF-16 later, that it goes through the default encoding, or whichever encoding variant we feel like it should use of UTF-16.
Sorry, I didn't understand. I understood the method name. I didn't understand your last comment. Try_write already exists for span of char. What were you referring to, Jeremy?
If you need to write UTF-16 to the network, then you would be writing into a span of byte. So
which is what this provides.
Well,
yeah,
or
but
you
I meant
saying you would write
UTF-16.
to it.
So
Span
if
of
we felt the
tar and
need, we could
cast.
say we could
I-
add
I-
try write UTF-16 next to
If
try
you
write
actually want
UTF-8.
If you actually want to send Unicode bytes, like UTF-16 bytes across the network, you can.
I'm not
Okay.
saying we should add it right now. I'm saying we would have the option in the future.
Got it.
Because as an extension method, the UTF-8 destination means nobody sees the parameter name, so the UTF-8ness is not really conveyed in the signature at all.
Sure.
So that's why I'd like to put the UTF-8 in the method name instead of just in the destination parameter name.
Fine.
So one other question. So let's assume the compiler will support string interpolation with U8 literals, right? Would we then want this to work at all? Like if we could have both of them, would we not want to say we want this to get a compile error and you actually have to use the suffix?
I don't think we'd want it to be an error. We might have an analyzer that says this would be faster if you tacked on U8.
But I mean, isn't the entire like string handler thing effectively for perf anyway? Like it seems like why would we go out of our way to make something fast that you shouldn't be using in the first place?
It's not just for perf. It's for simplicity and readability and writability.
The whole
Do you wanna-
interpolated UTF-8, we'd have to figure out. I mean, at the bigger picture, I'd have to figure out: is it going to call the datetime.now formatting as a UTF-8 string, and if so, how's it going to get that? Or is it going to be mixing UTF-8 and UTF-16 all over the place? At which point you might not. The U8 perf might actually end up being. I won't say worse, because if it's going through the interpolated string handler, it's all piecemeal. But until the U8 feature's designed, it could be that you put U8 on it and then it no longer compiles because you don't have a U8 thing for any of the holes.
That part I didn't understand. Like the handler is already piecemeal, right? So the one thing that I think is true is because basically what ends up happening is if you scroll at the APIs, my understanding is that the string portion, right, or the surrounding string is effectively emitted with append literal, right? And so all of those would go
Correct.
through append literal with with the constant, and then everything else that isn't constant would still have to go through the regular stuff, which might result in some transcoding, right? Because our infrastructure is generally about UTF-16.
Right, but depending, since this is the future feature, anything could be made up. It could be that the holes go through a different structure and that you end up with a U8 string, literal or interpolated string. You end up needing support on the various types that you're trying to put in the holes. Like that could be it could be the way it works out.
I mean,
I'm still not understanding that.
Yeah,
that the handler. I don't know. I'm just saying you may end up where like the datetime.now that it's passing in, if it's like, wait, I don't know how to convert this value to UTF-8, so you can't do this in a $U8. I could see that maybe being a problem with the feature. So I'm just saying it may not be 100% that you can put U8 in it and be a win.
I'm struggling to imagine a world where the feature would work that way. It would just call append formatted. The compiler today has no notion of it being of what the handler is doing. It's just handing off the data to a handler and says, do your thing, whatever that might be. Append formatted T.
Right.
It doesn't know that the handler's turning it into a UTF-16 string or a UTF-8 sequence of bytes or a picture.
Fair enough.
I mean, I would also imagine the implementation could do something like, if the T is an ISPAN formatable, what is it, ISPAN UTF-8 formatable, whatever we called it, it could do that, right? So there might be cases where you can. So what?
Append formatted will query. So today, memory extensions try write and string interpolation and string builder, like they all the implementation of append formatted asks the T, are you an ISPAN formatable?
Right.
And this will, in addition, first ask the T, are you an IUTF-8 span formatable?
Right.
If it is, it'll use it. If it's not, it'll say, are you an I span formatable? In which case, it'll format into some temporary space and then transcode. And otherwise, it'll say, are you an I formatable? In which case, it'll use its toString and transcode. Otherwise, it'll just call object.toString and transcode.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Like, I mean, I'm still coming back to this part here because it seems like there is no downside of always basically just saying you have to put U8 at the end if you want to get UTF-8 out of it. I mean, I'm not opposed to having both, but it seems like if we could choose, because we had support for both, it seems you would choose only UTF-8 here because it's just the literals, right?
I agree. If we had to choose one, U8 will certainly. I mean, if it works the way we would expect, which is it's just impacting how the literals are lowered, and if they're lowered as, string in one case and U8 and as a read-only span byte in the other, yes, it would be better to do the U8 one. Certainly, I don't see a downside to that.
Yeah, that's the only question I have, is because if that might mean we'd want to basically work with the C# team to make sure that they do support the interpolation for U8, and then we would only give you the one option. Seems like
we can certainly have that conversation. I am skeptical it will happen anytime soon.
Fair enough.
And we could, I think if it were to happen later and we added support for it later, I think we would basically just say, U8 works as long as you have the append literal that takes a read-only span byte. And then, that would end up being preferred. And then we could have an analyzer that said, hey, I see you're using this API, but you're not using U8. It'll work, but it'd be better if you stopped on U8. Here's a fix.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to it. Just seems it has more moving pieces.
Well, it's just it ends up being the same experience, except instead of getting an error, you get a warning or an info. So it works, and you could just make it better.
Yeah, and I've been, because you've reminded me how this feature works, my misapplied logic about the holes, I retract.
Okay. But to your point, Emo, it's a good conversation to have. And if they come, if folks from C# come back and say, oh yeah, that's trivial and we want to do it, then we could choose to remove the append literal that takes a string. But I'm a little skeptical just because the U8s are sufficiently different from strings that it's not I suspect it's not a very simple change, either to the compiler or to the language specification.
Aren't the U8s also more complicated / expensive on big Indian systems?
They're equally complicated. I mean, in both cases, they're stored in well, actually, strings have to, when strings are loaded on a big Indian system, they have to be fixed up. Read only span a byte. It's bytes. There's no endianness.
That's okay. Yeah. UTF-8 is, there's no machine Indian order. All right. So yeah, I think we should rename try-write to try-write UTF-8, and then we can pull the UTF-8 out of the word destination, and otherwise it seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, it seems good to me. I think some people might be sad when they turn their non-interpolated or their interpolated string into a non-interpolated string, and then they have to do more work. But I don't think it's a big deal.
You mean more work's going to happen under the covers? Is that what you mean?
No, meaning the overload for try-write that just takes read-only span of car, right? Isn't there or string? So you'll have to call UTF-8 without encoding. Oh, is that what I'm missing? There is one
that takes there's a try-write that takes a span of char.
Okay, I missed that. Is that in the same extensions class and it's for span of byte? It'll do the conversion. Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. This does the encoding, right? If you have a string, if you have an interpolated string. Anyway, that's all. I think it's fine as is.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm still not understanding. But if you want to talk to me offline, I'd happy to chat.
Yeah. Okay, we'll do. Did we decide that we're putting UTF-8 in the name? I guess that part I missed.
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's a good idea.
Jeremy feels strongly about it. There's not a huge downside. It's clear, and it keeps the door open for other things in the future. I mean, you can imagine having a try write that actually took an encoding object as an argument, but that also adds expense. So I wouldn't do that now. If we really needed that flexibility, we could look at it in the future.
Yeah, and like I'll talk to you offline, but to be really clear, I was suggesting like just one more overload. Try write UTF-8 span of byte destination span of car source, and that is what it is, right? And then it still have the out length and whatever, or out bytes written, whatever.
Sorry,
it would just be a shortcut for encoding. That's all.
So what is the overload?
So try write UTF-8 this span byte destination, comma, span car source, comma, out bytes written.
And all that does is call encoding.utf8.getBytes, passing those two arguments.
Yeah. Basically, it's a shortcut for encoding. Exactly.
But isn't that already what we have on encoding? Get bytes? Don't we have an overload for get bytes that gives you effectively the same thing?
It takes the read-only span of char and writes and a span of bytes. Yeah.
Yeah. Then I don't understand why that would, like, that's not shorter, right? You still have to do the try pattern, right?
Okay. Yeah. I guess it's just a discoverability thing. But yeah, we don't have to do it.
I see.
I mean, quite frankly, I think encoding is more discoverable than this. But
no,
I guess
all I'm saying is like you remove the dollar sign because you don't have a hole anymore, and then all of a sudden you're like, wait, what happened? Right? It's like now I'm just writing a literal.
I see. You're saying.
Yeah.
I understand. You remove the dollar sign and you want it to and all the holes.
So
you have a string and a string constant, a literal, and you want that to still compile.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's like more lines or more code to like do the encoding thing. I'm just saying that.
No, that
I would expect.
No, that one makes perfect sense to me now. Oh yeah, I agree. That seems like something we should consider.
To be clear, we don't have that with the existing one today either.
Okay, that's also fair for the car ones.
The try write into a span of char.
Right.
Char.
You can't say span of char dot try write with a string literal. You can say string literal dot try copy to and the destination span.
Yeah. Well, I agree that it is a little weird that if you had no holes and you remove the dollar sign that it stops compiling. It also doesn't feel entirely likely, and since there's not a symmetry thing, I'd hold off on doing it here and then see if we need to do it in both places.
Yeah. I'm not against doing it separately. It'd be useful to write out like, well, yeah, let's do it separately if we want to do it.
Yeah, I just
it's strictly additive. Yeah, so it's fine.
All right, then let's do this.
And besides, we can call it a feature right now of if you take the dollar sign away, it doesn't compile, and it's telling you it's going to write out these placeholders as the literal string, open curly, and the words you put in the middle. We're helping.
That's right. It's the analyzer we've always wanted for the forgotten dollar sign.
It's called syntax highlighting. But yes.
Or lack thereof.
Yeah. All right, so we have done that one then. I don't think that Jeremy is here yet, right? No. All right. I'm confused. What is the proposal now on this? Okay.
I mean, is that it? I mean, I guess that's the last thing before we marked it as ready, but it's weird that it starts with, we might want to use a design similar to name policy. It seems like it was a discussion point still.
Yeah, I think he just marked it afterwards, right?
Mhm.
As the proposal. But I feels a bit heavy-handed, but I guess sure. So I filed this and I kind of explained what the problem was. The problem was when you use a schema, you have to put basically this magic thing in there, right? So if your root object if you treat the entire document as a dictionary, then you're basically out of luck because you can no longer deserialize it as a dictionary, because we now say, sorry, the dollar schema thing is not an actual valid key. So it just throws an exception. It's not that you get a dictionary with this thing being in there, you just get an exception that it can't map this guy.
We don't recognize schemas at all today, right? Like we have zero support for them. Is that a true statement?
That is a true statement. And I mean, the desire here for me was not that it recognizes it, it's just that I have a file on this that I would like to edit with an editor and get IntelliSense, right? That's why I have a schema in here. And now basically if I do that, then, you know, I can no longer deserialize it as a dictionary.
I thought there was a property that says let $sign things go into a dictionary already.
Sorry, the problem, I misspoke. The problem isn't the string here, the problem is this one here, right? Because basically now this is a string and not an object, and it says like, sorry, you can't put that string into that object.
So you want to like ignore $ keys completely for deserialization?
So either that or just literally special case dollar schema and say we know what it means and it's not meant to be in the dictionary, right? There's multiple ways you can skin that cat. The proposal here is effectively to say, like, you know, you have full control, right? You derive from this thing and then you say ignore that, right? Or you basically just have a built-in one that says ignore metadata names, which I think is everything starting with $. Which I guess works. That would be good.
I'm surprised to see I understand why the proposal's doing UTF-8 string for the key, but I didn't think we'd actually let the UTF-8ness leak into the API anywhere yet.
I think this might be the same that we do on Json naming policy then, because I'm pretty sure we do it all over the place. All over the place might be a bit of a stretch, but I think the key abstraction, I think we assume that it's UTF-8. I could be wrong though.
I'm looking at Json naming policy. I see
You're
string
right.
convert name.
It's just convert name of a string, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that seems then inconsistent. I would agree with that.
At which point this is just hash set of string.
Well, depends on what you do, right?
I mean, I guess using a custom type, the implementation could pre-convert things to UTF-8 because it knows it's using a UTF-8 reader under the covers, and it could also, I guess, take the JSON encoded text parameter, or whatever it wants. But I was just looking at it just seems like this is hash set a string.
Well, I'm saying it's not, because the problem is that if we go down that path, then it's kind of inconsistent with what we did in other places, right? Also, like hash set of string, it's not really what you want, right? You want to have a rule that says if it starts with $, ignore it. I don't want to pre-populate this thing with everything that could come after $, right?
And that's true.
If you were trying to model it in that way, and I'm not saying we should, you would accept an I set And the isets implementation would logically be anything that begins with a $sign is in the set. And so its contains method would do that check. It wouldn't actually contain anything.
Yeah, I guess that's also possible. But then, I mean, that seems even more heavy-handed, right?
Oh, I don't disagree. I'm just saying that's how you would model it without having to actually do a lookup. Your contains would just have the logical set, not a physical set of actual things in a dictionary.
Yeah, I guess I was reading it the other way around of that that ignore key wasn't answering should I ignore this key. I was reading it as the imperative statement that the caller is saying if you see this key, ignore it, at which point it would be just building it like hash set. And which I guess means that the ignore key, since you're actually interrogating it for an answer, it seems more like should ignore key, because should is what you want the answer to. Ignore is a void directive. But then there's the question of what the signature should be. I think everything else we've done string, and I know that they would want to do UTF-8 for perf based on the fact that we still haven't written a UTF-16 JSON reader, but that feels like the first time we're leaking that implementation detail into the surface.
I mean, we do have JSON naming policy, and we take string there, right? And that thing clearly is used literally all over the serializer, right? So I mean, if you find it acceptable there, then why wouldn't we find this acceptable for this one case where we have keys, right?
String sounds fine to me.
I mean, I'm fine with the abstraction as proposed, because then you basically get to decide how you want to do it, whether it's just simply rule-based or whether you actually have a dictionary behind the scenes. That's up to you to decide. And I suppose the one we would ship in box, the ignore metadata names, would just be rule-based and say starts with $, don't care.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is reasonable. I don't think anybody really wants custom key handling. It's just $, don't care. And that would give me that. So then I guess the feedback for us would be, we are fine except for the UTF-8ness, right? In which case you would say it's string key, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel not super strongly, but enough to say it again, that I think that, to me, ignore is a verb that should imply a void return. And since this is doing an interrogation, I think it should be should ignore. But it's niche, so I don't super care.
No, it's totally niche. I think because I mean, the problem for me was there's no simple way for me to work this around, right? I basically have to, like, I think what I ended up doing was you load the document and you remove the key manually before they call the deserializer. That's really the only simple thing you can do. Because otherwise you have to like mess with the built-in dictionary deserializer, which you don't want to do.
Right. I mean, I'm just thinking, the documentation, this, should say, returns true if the serializer should ignore this key. Well, it turns out that means that the verb or the method name should be should ignore key, because you've
Sure, I don't care about that.
How is JSON deciding whether something is a quote quote dictionary or not? Is it based on a particular interface?
No, it's just you decide, right? When you deserialize, you tell it, right? This is the line of code that says treat this as a dictionary, right?
There's also the overflow property bucket thing.
If I said deserialize iDictionary, is that also?
I believe then.
Or that won't work because.
Yeah, there's some built-in knowledge about primitives, right? If you say iList, I think it gives you an array. I think iDictionary gives you a dictionary, right? So we have some of that. We specify some abstractions.
So dictionary in the name of this option maps to a very specific set and well-established set of things. I guess that's what I'm primarily asking, is the correlation between this property and the behaviors that will be applied to certain types.
Yeah, I mean, there's a built-in deserializer dedicated for dictionaries, and we already have other things with like, what do we do when there's duplicate keys, for example, right? So there already is kind of like, it already leaks into the JSON serializer that dictionaries are special when you deserialize them. If that's kind of the question you're asking.
It's not. It's less about whether dictionaries are super special and more whether there are other things that this policy would apply to as well. If I asked it to deserialize a sorted dictionary, if I asked it to deserialize a concurrent dictionary, if I asked it to deserialize an immutable dictionary, or Stephen's custom dictionary, like,
yeah. Does this also
this...
apply on directly mapped properties? Like, does the key filter kick in?
No, the key filter. So normally, early. So if this would be a regular object, right? The way you would do this is you can either say, I don't care about unmet properties, right? There already is a configuration of the serializer, or you literally just define your own property dummy that you just give the JSON name $schema, right? If you want to just eat it up. The problem is with dictionaries, you don't get to do that because that's magically built into the deserializer, right? So you don't get to mess with the keys.
So I'm saying just more for the name of the property on the serializer options or whatever. Of is it going to imply that this is only for dictionaries, or is it going to imply that it's for all properties coming from JSON?
So based on the discussion we had, is like it only applies to dictionaries. It doesn't apply to regular objects.
Oh, I see. It's called dictionary key filter. Yeah. That was the part that I was.
Yeah. The question to Stephen is, I don't know whether we support other instances of dictionary. I don't think we do.
We do, actually. I just found the docs for it, but for like sorted dictionary and stuff specifically.
I mean, this wouldn't change though, right? Whatever types we support as dictionaries, whether it's, I suppose it's iDictionary, it's dictionary, and then, sorted dictionary, like whatever is in there, that, yeah, it would apply to those, right? So this wouldn't change the behavior.
Right, like as long as it's not affecting like deserializing into known properties and stuff, I think it sounds reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, that's why they named it the way they did, I think. Because there's other options that also only apply to dictionaries, right? There's, what is this called again? If I can find it. Oh God. Yeah, we already have dictionary key policy, which basically is a JSON naming policy. And that's the same thing, basically. It controls what kind of keys are we emitting, right? Which is different from properties, because on properties, again, you get to decide on a per property basis.
What is on that type? Like, would the filter make more sense to be on?
No, so the dictionary key policy is of type JSON naming policy. So it's just, what casing do you want? It's not greatly named, but it's just a naming policy.
Okay.
But to your point, we could probably name this dictionary key filter policy, but that seems excessive, right? I think just prefacing with dictionary key makes sense because then it's next to dictionary key policy, but.
Yep, that seems fine.
Hey guys, sorry, I missed that we were reviewing JSON APIs.
Oh no, it's not your fault. We did not book it, so it's just we're just waiting for someone else to join, and so we took this one.
Yeah, just
it's going to be quote a little bit late.
I'm guessing people were discussing whether why the ignore key was accepting a read-only span of byte as input.
Yes, we discussed that. Yes.
Yeah. Just for context, that was added because unlike JSON naming policy, this will run in the hot path. JSON naming policy only runs when you are in the process of configuring your JSON contract, which only happens once. On the other hand, this would be called every time you are deserializing a dictionary. So it actually makes sense in that case to not incur the cost of converting a UTF-8 representation of the property name, which is the native way that JSON handles things.
But if they return false, you're going to turn it into a string anyway, because that's what you're going to use as the key for the dictionary. So while it means you did do an unnecessary conversion into string of a thing that you said you were going to ignore, I assume ignore is going to be the minority case.
Sure, but it's not necessarily the case that the key type is a string. It could be an integer. Any type that has an underlying JSON representation as a JSON string could, in principle, be a key on a dictionary. So sure, that's definitely the case. But if for whatever reason your key type is an integer, then you will have forced a conversion to an intermediate string that you immediately throw away. Now, maybe that's not important because by default we wouldn't have that specified. So maybe convenience.
Well, I mean, it's really nothing else in the JSON serializer is exposed that the underlying reader is UTF-8 based. Literally nothing. So this doesn't get to either.
But basically, I think what he is saying is that if you have a dictionary today that is just comprised of numbers as keys, right? In the current version, we don't allocate at all, right? We just basically give you numbers, right? And now, because in order for us to call the API, we now have to allocate a string. And then it says true, and we say, great, let's keep it, and we throw the string away, right? So you effectively regress a scenario that right now doesn't allocate.
I mean, you only regress it if you actually specify the filter.
Yeah,
right?
If you have a dictionary with a numeric key type and you've specified a filter.
I think that's fair. I think we can say, because there's an opt-in policy, the only people that care are the ones that filter. So yeah, I guess I can get behind that.
Yeah. So did you...
I would prefer this. I mean, if we really feel strongly, I think we can probably add other APIs later, right? We could have another overload or something. And then we could say you can derive it, and then we can avoid the transcoding. But it seems niche enough that I think I would start with, let's assume we don't care.
Did you not agree to put a should in front of the abstract method name?
No, I think that's when Eric joined. So what did you say? You wanted to call it should ignore key?
Yeah.
Yeah,
again, I'm just thinking of what the docs would say. It's returns true if the serializer should ignore this key. That means should ignore this key. We get rid of this. Should ignore key is
reasonable. All right, so then anything else, or does this cover it?
I think it covers it, but I had one question on something Eric said. If I'm deserializing a dictionary today, you're saying that the keys aren't run through the naming policy?
No, they are, because there is a property, right? Dictionary key policy, right? Which controls the naming policy. It just depends if the keys are in JSON, non-strings, right? Which is valid. They could be numbers, right? Then we wouldn't run them, supposedly.
But if they are strings, we do run them. Which means allocating a string to pass to the naming policy and potentially getting back a different string that the naming policy converted.
I would think so.
But that would only be exercised in the case where you specify a dictionary key policy and also the dictionary key type is string. But you're right, like you would be creating an intermediate string value that you convert to another string.
And the dictionary key policy is defaulted to null as well, right?
Sorry?
The dictionary key policy, like the naming policy, is also optional, right? Like it's not set by default, right?
Yeah, for what it's worth, if I recall correctly, the naming policy is kind of a mapping function. I might be wrong, but I think it takes a string and it returns a string. So it might be the case that you're not throwing away the intermediate allocation. You might be, doing a pass-through and only making changes under specific cases. So it's not necessarily the case that the string would get thrown away. In the case of the filter, I think you'd always be creating something that you'd be throwing away.
In the case of the filter running for something that wasn't also that wasn't for a dictionary of string
correct
t value.
Correct. But I can't answer the question as to whether the filtering should be happening at the place where the converter actually converts the underlying UTF-8 representation to a key type representation. So I don't know. I'm not gonna. It's been a while since I've looked at the implementation, so I wouldn't make any assumptions here. But generally speaking, I think that in principle we might be able to reuse the key for string types, but we'd be allocating for no reason for non-string key types.
I mean, one question in chat actually kind of makes sense to me is like, why do you call the filter for non-string keys? I think we could say we only call them when the keys are strings, right?
Wasn't your original scenario that you had a schema in a dictionary and that dictionary may not have had string keys?
I think maybe it's if you have schema and you have numeric keys, then you get to get them as strings and convert them on your own.
Yeah, what happens in JSON when you have like mismatches in types? Like some keys are ints, some keys are, or numbers I should say, and some are literals, literal strings. Is that valid in JSON?
No.
Interesting. So in that case, how would you apply a schema then? You would be screwed, I guess. Can't have a schema for this. I mean, that's fine, I guess. I mean, I think to me it would make sense to say we would just run the filter in the same, like only when we run the naming policy as well. Or if you would have run the naming policy, if it would have been specified, I guess. So we wouldn't run it for non-strings.
I would think that I'd expect these to be mutually exclusive, as in.
Why? You want to ignore things that start with a $sign, but you want to Pascal case other things. Yeah. Unless you want to say that the naming policy returning null is the way that you can ignore it, in which case we can solve it with no new type.
Well, I would not do that because that makes the composition really ugly, right? Because now you have to basically say snake case with ignore metadata names, right? So it's hard to give people a pre-baked version of that. They now have to actually derive the type. Versus in the current model, you just set both of them, right? They compose nicely. But is that what you meant, Eric? Like mutually exclusive of the naming policy, or mutually exclusive between numbers?
Mutually exclusive in the sense that, you know, in the canonical scenario, you have a JSON object that whose property names are numeric representations, and as such, you want to be able to filter things that don't match that representation. So, in the cases where you deserialize as a dictionary that's keyed on integers, for example, you wouldn't be applying a naming policy in that case because you don't care about making transformations to the names. You just want to like directly convert the UTF-8 representation to an integer, and as well skip any UTF-8 representations that don't match what you're looking for. To me, it almost feels as if the filter is something you're running earlier on as you are still processing JSON. As you're processing the JSON tokens. And once you make a determination that something should be ignored, then you shouldn't be ignored rather, then you continue applying the naming policies and the key conversions and what have you.
I would agree with that. I mean, like that seems like the way to think about this. And that's not an implementation detail, right? Because that controls what strings you see here, right? So we would have to say like, this runs before the naming policy is applied.
Yeah.
Which again makes sense to me. It's like, why would you apply a policy? You can just do it.
I mean, once you're applying a policy, you're actually committed to the fact that, oh, I'll be deserializing whatever exists as a value with this property, right?
Right.
Like you will be binding this to an entry in the dictionary you're deserializing to. Whereas the filter basically says, if this returns false, then skip everything under that property. You're not materializing anything
right
within that JSON object entry.
So then I'll be saying we apply it for keys of any type. We just convert it to a string and call you.
Yeah, I think the key type, even though the key scenario is non-string key types, I would say that what the key type is on deserialization is immaterial. You just check the whatever UTF-8 representation exists in the property name. We can, of course, convert it to a string if you feel that this makes it easier for the user. But obviously, the trade-off the trade-off is that you'd be incurring additional string allocations that would be wasted in the canonical scenario where this is meant to be used.
Yeah, I'm personally fine with that because the alternative is worse. The alternative is I have to load the document, remove the key by hand, and that's like more expensive than whatever you're doing right now.
Yeah.
So then we are saying effectively we will apply this policy before dictionary key policy, and we will run it for both string and non-string key types.
Yep.
All right, people on the call still with us, or everybody is like, don't care?
I'm here.
I'm not going to say don't care.
Yeah,
but I decided that you and Eric had it well handled. I'll say that.
All right.
Exactly. And I think that the combination of wanting to use the filter and using a dictionary with a numeric key type sounds so esoteric that I don't care about the extra string allocations for the keeping the type consistent with the way it's representing data.
So Imo, what was it's been a while since I visited this issue. What was the initial motivating example?
So in my case, what I have, like concretely, I have a JSON file that basically has key bindings. And so I treat the entire JSON file as a dictionary from, effectively the string representation of the key to its binding. And so my custom type is just the key binding type or whatever. And so, but I want to edit this file, like a civilized person. So I would like to get some IntelliSense for the actual object, right? But now the problem is because the first entry, its value is just a plain string. I immediately throws an exception that says it can't convert that string to the custom type, right?
So it's basically entries that the value schema doesn't match what you're deserializing as a value.
Correct.
Okay.
And so my workaround was I just load this document, remove the first the schema key, and then I pass it to the serializer, right? Which, sure, that works, but feels a bit heavy-handed. All right, then I guess we are at the point where we are. So I don't know why this keeps happening. Like this really messes with me that the preview stays. All right, so then.
Evan, if you're listening in, we have a bug for you to fix. I don't care if it's not your department.
Okay, Jeremy is now here, so I suppose that means our quick one is now over. and we go back to the what was it? This one here, right? No, actually, this was the one, right? Yay!
Yeah. Sorry, guys, for the delay. My appointment ran long.
That's okay. It just means you have 50 minutes now, rather than a full hour.
I will do the best that I can. Okay. So this proposal is similar to some of the COM proposals in the fact that it's for, obviously, interop with native APIs. But this is formed more around the general idea of a native API is represented by a table of function pointers and possibly a pointer to a native object. So we should present some mechanism to easily map this into managed code in a way that users can interact with. So this has a lot of different building blocks that can be reused by the COM source generator, and we'd like to use under the hood, but otherwise we can always do as like file scope types and so on and so forth. And the main goals behind this proposal are to enable supporting APIs similar to MS Quick, which uses the function pointer model, JNI, which uses the basically native object V tables with abstract methods, same thing like COM, but without GUIDs, without IUnknown. And we could use this, at least some components of this, as once again building blocks for other API bindings, possibly using something like this with Swift. You could use this to manually build up a table for things like OpenGL, where you have a function where you call to get function pointers. So you could call that function, build up your own table, and then use this mechanism to provide wrappers. So that's the basic concept. If we go through the various APIs, we have the first one is just an interface that represents the concept of I have a pointer for an unmanaged object. How do I get a managed object from that pointer if this pointer wraps a managed object? So like, for example, with COM wrappers, you can get a pointer to represent your managed object. You can go back from that pointer to the underlying managed object. So the interface provides the concept, and then the attribute would be used by the generator. And then COM wrappers, unwrapper is an example implementation. That's the first three elements. Then the next ones are marshallers that represent how to marshal an exception, because when you have an unmanaged callers only method, you can't propagate exceptions across it except in Windows. So we need some concept of, we need a generalized concept of how do you marshal an exception from managed code into native code. And these four marshallers, there should be a fourth one here as well. Yes, there are four marshallers here that represent the different concepts that are used within the existing built-in COM system when you use the preserve sig option, where we don't introduce the H results return value ourselves, where if you provide an int or a uint, we convert the exception to its H result. If you provide a floating point type return, like float or double, we return nan. For any other types, we return default, and for void, we just swallow it. So this is kind of, once again, more building blocks. Yeah, I kind of wrote out this API in the order of, like, not the order of usage, but the order of, like, types need to be introduced so that references work. Sorry.
When you say default, you mean like default of T, aka 0?
Yes. We basically, if it's any type other than int, uint, float, or double, we just return default of T for the exception. That's how the built-in system works. So providing that, so this is part of providing that option, so that we don't have to build any code into the generator around handling exceptions. We can have everything following the same model that we did with library import. Everything is in different marshallers. And if we go down,
yeah, on that one, I'm sure we've used default to mean the 0 state of a value in other places, but the problem is, since it says default marshaller, This sounds like if you are in a place where you feel like you need to talk about a marshaller, that this is the one that you want by default, and it sounds like it's the one that you least want by default. So I think that we need to come up with a better name for that one.
You can always insert an as, right? You could say exception as H result, exception as none, exception as default, exception. I guess swallow exception marshaller is just swallow exception marshaller. I don't know what else.
Yeah.
Or we could do exception as void marshaller, because that's what it is. It's the exception as a void value.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I mean,
throwing the exception into the void. So
I mean,
Yeah.
presumably if that's the behavior you have, so like I don't quite understand, like, why do you need these attributes? Because isn't now the behavior effectively a function of what you declare the method as?
So if we get down to the next, the exception marshalling enum, this goes into, and the attribute. The exception marshalling enum is used on the attribute to say what type of exception marshalling do I want, and this is following the same pattern we use on the library import generator, where we have a string marshalling enum that has some predefined well-known names that have well-defined behavior, and then we have a custom option where you can specify your own, including the long form name of the same built-in options. So basically right here we have two options. There's custom, which is you say what marshaller you want, excuse me, and then com, where the com marshaller, basically it picks based on the unmanaged type of your return type which marshaller to use, so that we match the existing behavior for the preserve when you put preserve sig on a method on a com import interface.
Sorry, where is the attribute?
So we have the enum here and then the attribute down below, and this attribute is what goes on each method, saying I am a method on a virtual method table.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and then we have exception marshalling and exception marshalling type, the exact same model as string marshalling and string marshalling custom type. So we should probably change exception marshalling type to exception marshalling custom type to match.
So basically what you're saying is, I suppose the default of exception marshalling would be custom then, or is it com?
It's custom by default. And then you can say, I want com style behavior. And then it picks which of the marshallers to use based on the unmanaged return type. But you can also use those types explicitly if you want to.
But isn't that kind of a pit-off failure? If I now move to source generation, like whatever my declarations are, now I have to mess with them and actually tell you that no, actually I don't want custom to mean do whatever. Yeah, I want to just preserve the current behavior.
So with moving to, we'd have our analyzer and code fix convert a preserve sig method on com import to use exceptionmarshalling.com, because a big part of the design for this API is we don't want it to be com centric. We don't want its defaults to be focused on whatever com's defaults are. We want something similar to how we did library import, where our defaults are
not Win API.
Like very much, yeah, they're not Win API, not com. They're very platform agnostic.
Right.
So by default, you have to say what exception marshaller you want.
Got it.
Otherwise, we let it propagate and crash the process, I think is the current design, or we swallow it. It's one of the two.
So what
and we
happens?
Can decide what we want as the default.
Yeah. So I guess what happens now when you have, let's say, a method that returns an int, and the default is unspecified, so you default to custom. Does it mean you swallow, or you basically just look at this and says like, well, I don't know what to do?
I will check what we have in the prototype, but I don't remember. I think we just swallow is the default, because if we let it propagate, it crashes the process. So we just swallow it and do nothing is our default.
I see. I mean, it seems a bit weird that the default is that we swallow errors. It seems like you would want to crash in the case where you have an error, so you don't accidentally just keep going.
Yeah, if Aaron is available to comment, I'd like to hear his suggestion on what we do. It's just there's not a good option of there's no good option of how to propagate the error back in a.
I mean, another option you have
manner
is kind of saying like if you just apply the attribute, right, and you don't specify exception marshalling, or you set it explicitly to custom, and you didn't apply any of these attributes, then the analyzer could warn you and say like, sorry, you did not tell me what you want to have here happen, right?
Yeah, I don't know if we'd want to do it as a maybe. Yeah, we could do that where we have a warning or at least a notice diagnostic saying you should specify some form of exception marshalling.
I mean, it does seem like, I guess if you default is swallow and you give me a warning, I think I could live with that. But it does seem weird to me if you just apply the minimum attribute and then we just default to, sorry, we basically just swallow the error and don't tell you anything. That seems like a bit of failure.
I'm trying to remember what we do with reverse. I think with reverse p invokes, we just let it propagate and crash the process. So we could just keep that similar model of just, if you don't say how you want to handle exceptions, we will not handle any exceptions.
I think when in doubt, a clean crash is probably preferable over just swallowing and moving.
Okay, so yeah, so we could have it as the default. Basically, if you don't specify any exception marshalers, we will not emit a catch and just let the process crash. Or because then it'll crash on non-Windows and propagate on Windows is part of the weirdness. Because Windows, we have exception interop that lets you propagate exceptions through unmanaged frames. So that was part of the concern. And then it's if you explicitly say custom, then you have to specify a custom marshaler. That's the same model we have a string marshaling. Is if you explicitly say custom, you have to specify one. And we verify that in the generator.
So that makes sense to
There
me.
a queue call or something to suppress the Windows exception marshaling?
No, there was absolutely no way whatsoever to suppress Windows exception marshaling because we just use the underlying system and just let Windows propagate it because the runtime emits Windows compatible frames.
I mean, I guess your p invokes aren't really going to be consistent across systems anyway. I mean, very rarely, at least. I mean, you could be using a third-party library that is built the same or built multiple platform. But I don't like Windows being, I don't like one OS being different than the other. It's not Windows that I care about particularly. I feel like you're in the level here where you're really writing basically OS-specific code, so you're going to do OS-specific testing.
Yeah. And I guess you can always write a custom exception marshaler that crashes the process on an exception. If you want it to be consistent everywhere.
Environment.failfast is Jared's favorite method.
Yeah. That might actually be another a good built-in option for us to provide is
fail fast.
Yeah, some sort of fail fast of this native API has no mechanism whatsoever for us to represent passing the result of an exception back.
Exception
so
fail fast marshaler. What's it marshal as? It didn't. Game over.
Another option on the enum, like custom com fail fast sort of thing.
Would it be on the enum or would it just be on the literally a marshaler type?
I think that one might be common enough that it's worth bringing up to the enum, but we could start with it not part of the enum as just a marshaler type, and then we can add the enum if enough people use it.
Yeah, I think I would like that. Like if you go down that path, I think the nice thing is it's clear what the default behavior is, right? Because basically you're saying that you would say, the enum has the first entry would be fail fast 0. So that's the behavior you're getting. If you just say the default is custom and then you have a bunch of marshalers, well, I still don't know which one you pick from those.
I mean, we could say that custom with no registered custom handler is you get the fail fast handler.
No, we can't say that. It's just less discoverable, right?
Yeah.
Right. But it's custom and then you didn't customize it. So it hits the fallback handler, which is crash your app.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's not well defined. I'm just saying from a developer standpoint, it's you just have
I guess
to know.
there would be the problem of we would then want an explicit marshaler of exception, Windows exception passing marshaler of don't do anything and let Windows flow this back.
So this part I
Or-
didn't get. What do you mean by
Yeah.
Windows passing it back?
Well, Jeremy said that on Windows, if you do nothing, the exception will go from managed into native, and then it'll come back into managed, because that's just a feature that we already have on
Yeah,
Windows
Win-
only.
Yeah,
So it
on
may
Windows, our exceptions are just regular SEH exceptions.
Oh, I
So
see.
you can catch them with SEH handlers,
I
which
see.
So-
is just really annoying and sucks.
yeah, so that may mean that we want a public exception SEH marshaller.
Yeah, and then we could
Um,
throw a supported OS platform Windows attribute on it.
Yeah. What would be the difference between failfast being a enum option and a visible marshaller?
It's just more terse if we can put it on, if we put it on the enum, so you don't have to say custom and then specify the marshaller.
Right, but if custom's the default, then I guess really you only ever have to specify one or the other.
Like right now for string marshalling, the default is custom, but if you don't specify custom, it doesn't work. Like you have to specify the custom type, and then UTF-16 and UTF-8 are the ones that are on the enum.
So if I don't assign exception marshalling and I just assign exception marshalling type, it's basically ignored.
No, because the default value of exception marshalling will be 0, which says custom, which says see the type. So
Oh,
would-
sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. Gotcha.
that would work.
So you're saying if we make the failfast marshaller the default,
Then when you want custom, you have to say custom explicitly.
Or we just document that the behavior of if you give no handler is failfast.
Yeah.
That it is the if you
Yeah.
have a null marshalling type. I mean, I guess if the generator is already gonna, because the generator is gonna give you an error if you said custom but don't give the type. So
Yeah.
so I guess instead of having it be a default, yeah, it should either be an enum member or a visible type. And then we just let the thing tell you you're not allowed to do a default. No, there is no default. You have to specify either some known enum based marshalling or register a custom handler.
And if we're going to make it required, then we could actually put the exception marshalling as a parameter in the constructor.
Well, but you're changing an existing attribute, right?
No, virtual method
this is
index
new.
attribute is a new attribute. So we can go for the attribute type as well. This attribute goes on a method on an interface saying this method is at this index into the v table that this type represents. And then you can say whether or not it has a this parameter, and then the usual marshalling information and the exception marshalling.
Yeah.
I don't think I would do that because the problem is they're all types. So pretty much anything goes, right? Which is not great for constructor experience. Like for enums, I think it's fine, but the problem is with super generic types like ins or types or strings was like you have to know what you're supposed to put there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like we could put the enum in the construct. We could put the exception marshalling enum in the constructor and say you have to specify either failfast, custom, or com. And then if you specify custom, then you also have to set the property.
That seems reasonable to me, but was it, for ease of use, if we think that custom would be the most common case, then that would mean that we would say that you should be able to overload it, but now you're in attribute land and we say that optional things should be settable properties instead of constructor overloads.
Yeah.
So, which basically brings us back to what's on screen.
Yeah. So there's one other question here. I'm noticing that I somehow didn't make it into the actual proposal on this attribute, but there's also a proposal for direction, because sometimes for your native API, you only need to be able to call the native API from managed. Like, for example, we don't need to provide a JNI implementation in C#. You just need to be able to call JNI. So you can say you only need managed to unmanaged or unmanaged to managed. And where is that type? Yeah, it's a Marshall. So it's a Marshall direction enum. I guess in the rearrangements of all of these API proposals, things kept getting moved around. And eventually it didn't get added somehow. I'll go put it in right now just for clarity.
So then,
okay. So here I added it on. So basically, you can say whether or not. Oh, whoops! Sorry, forgot to put the actual name of the property. Sorry, I should have taken a quick look over this beforehand.
So you said
here.
Where's here in your world? Is that the chat in Teams or?
In the API review, it just popped up below set last error. I just updated the API review in place.
Ah. Oh, naughty boy.
It was here because it was right on the screen. Marshall direction.
Oh, this one here?
Yes. So basically you can say, is this stub only needs to support managed to unmanaged, unmanaged to managed, or both directions? Because, like, for example, JNI, we don't need to provide an implementation of both sides. But if we needed to pass like a callback object to JNI, then that we want to be able to support the opposite direction or possibly both directions.
But no, this applies to anything like return types, parameters, right? Isn't that a bit too broad?
So this is for this method in particular. Do we generate a managed to unmanaged stub or an unmanaged to managed stub or both?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So then this ties in, if you look at the names, like managed to unmanaged or unmanaged to managed, and then you compare that to the custom marshaller directions or the Marshall modes, you have managed to unmanaged in, managed to unmanaged ref, and managed to unmanaged out, and then vice versa for unmanaged to managed. So that the idea of the Marshall modes was for like managed to unmanaged in refers to an in or by value parameter for a managed to unmanaged stub. So then when your Marshall direction is managed to unmanaged, an in parameter would use the managed to unmanaged in marshaller. That's kind of how the idea of the pieces fit together.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the property makes sense to me.
Yeah. And then the concern, the reason I brought this up is exception marshalling only matters in the unmanaged to managed direction. So that's where some of the concern comes from. About like how required do we want to make it for you to specify exception marshalling if a whole like 50+% of the use cases doesn't need it because it doesn't support that direction.
So then you're saying you would key off an analyzer based on what you said for direction?
It would, yeah, basically, is we'd be like, if you like, you need to specify exception marshalling if you are supporting unmanaged to managed. Is where this becomes a really interesting case of I'm not sure the right way to do it.
I mean, I think I'm more a fan of that design because at least that one is, you look at what data the user provided and you give better actionable diagnostics rather than trying some convoluted like constructor syntax where we screw ourselves over time.
Yeah. So we could just say if your direction is not managed to unmanaged only, then you need to specify an exception marshalling.
But is
Wait,
this property
Wouldn't
used for...
exception marshalling only be on managed to unmanaged?
Bidirectional.
applies
It's
that?
Sorry.
unmanaged to managed or bidirectional.
Yeah.
Is right, but when does this exception handling come in? Is it unmanaged to managed or managed to unmanaged?
Unmanaged to managed, because it's a try catch wrapping the call to the managed call. Because otherwise, the caller of the stub is managed code.
Oh, so that's saying that this is so the exception handling applies when it's a reverse p invoke.
Yes, when it's the reverse p invoke model, that's when the exception handling.
And that
Who
one's called
applies.
unmanaged to managed because unmanaged is the caller.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. It makes sense now.
Somebody is asking, should exception marshalling type be named exception marshalling custom type, like string marshalling custom type?
Yeah, that came up earlier.
Probably, yeah. I noticed that as I was scrolling through and realized I hadn't made that consistent.
So like halfway on your screen, it says string marshalling custom type, and at the bottom it says just exception marshalling
Exception
type.
marshalling type.
So the
Yeah,
property
it should
is-
be.
The enum property is correct. It's the type property at the bottom. Should have custom before type.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
To match what we did for. I assume the string marshaller called it string marshalling custom type.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So do you ever derive from the attribute, or should it be sealed?
It should be sealed. And then there was an interface from the COM proposal that we had that looks like it got removed because I moved it over to the COM proposal and forgot to copy it back over. Was the I unmanaged interface type, which basically it would provide a void star star. I'll comment this on the bottom, I guess, because it was supposed to be copied back in here. Where are you? Here we go.
So where did you add it?
I'm going to comment it on the bottom. Who do we end up call? I want to have names consistent with the other system, so I need to
What?
check exactly the name we used in the COM. Managed virtual method table is the name that we used. Perfect. Void star star.
I mean, you say we care about consistency, like
Yes,
we ever
here.
did.
Yeah. So I have it on the bottom. I just commented it.
Oh, at the very bottom?
Yeah. So basically providing a mechanism for on the interface. And this one we should probably do with T. So
do you mean you made a new comment on the issue, Jeremy? Or
Yes.
you? Yeah. So control N demo
Oh,
all the way down.
it wasn't clear what down meant. Okay.
sorry. Yeah. So this interface basically provides a mechanism to be able to get a fully constructed managed virtual method table for the unmanaged to managed direction. The main reason to provide this interface and the property is so that users don't need to know the entire unmanaged signature of the generated unmanaged to managed stubs, because otherwise to be able to take the address of those stubs and then to be able to construct the table, they need to be able to know the unmanaged signature and be able to write it out manually, which kind of defeats some of the purpose of the source generating marshalling interop, because then you still need to know all the unmanaged names, write it all out into a function pointer type to take the address of the unmanaged to managed stubs to then put into the table.
So remind me again, like how do I use these interfaces? I basically implement them on my custom types.
Yes, so if you look at in the API usage, it doesn't have the generic on the I unmanaged interface type, but the mechanism would be that the user would, jeez, wow,
I see
tabs
here.
really messed this up. Yeah, so the user writes just on the first part, they'd write the iNative API, they'd specify the unmanaged object unwrapper if they need the unmanaged to managed direction, and then implement the unmanaged interface type of their type, specify their methods, and then we'd generate the implementation of the unmanaged interface type with all the allocations and put all the pieces together for you, so that all you have to do is call that property to be able to get out the table so that you could build up your own object, similar to how we build up the objects in COM.
So the user writes the first two or just the first?
The user writes the first one. And then we generate the
Everything
rest.
I see.
Yeah, we generate other code. The other idea, so I'll explain the other component of iNative API 2. After looking at the scan, I remember what was going on here. The idea was in iNative API 1, we generate everything. In iNative API 2, if the user wants to provide their own implementation of unmanaged interface type so they can allocate memory however they want, we would provide a method for them to call that would fill in the vtable once the user has allocated it, so that they don't need to deal with taking all the addresses of everything. And then option 3 is just example of usage of the generated information.
I see. So the second one is still an example of what the user would write if they want to tweak this behavior, right?
Yes, if they wanted to, yeah, iNative API 2 is an example of them tweaking the allocation and storage behavior, but the generator would still provide the fill in the managed virtual method table.
And then presumably, okay, sorry, I didn't see this. So this is basically partial as well. So the user always declares them as partial because we fill in the other side.
Yes. And we would generate a nested interface type named native that would provide the managed to unmanaged implementation and would have the members that provide all of the stubs.
Gotcha.
And then it would be marked with iDynamic interface castable to allow you to provide an IDIC implementation to call into it. But as long all your implementation has to do is implement unmanaged virtual method table provider, which we approved with the COM types, because that's the kind of the communication type here,
right?
And then provide an implementation.
I mean, this is pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah. It's basically, this is all of the building blocks to build. This is 99% of the building blocks to build COM. There's like one building block that we're keeping in the COM generator and not exposing it to concept for, because it's very COM specific.
I think there is one statement here that should be made. None of this is needed from a public API surface area. Like, this is not, none of this needs to be public. This was just, here's all the infrastructure around that permits us to make it public and grow the ecosystem in a way that is as extendable as possible.
So when you say none of this, you mean the entire issue or the example we just looked at?
The entire issue, like none of this is part of the prize 0 super important COM source generator. This is all building blocks for the interop ecosystem as a whole. And there's one aspect of this that provides something for the COM system that we don't have otherwise, but we could choose to provide through a different mechanism if we so desired.
So based on my earlier question, like it sounded like the reason you want to have this is so that your design isn't coupled to COM, right? So if you wouldn't have any of this, wouldn't you then basically be back into this? Okay, we have to provide some default experiences here.
Yeah, and basically all of those helper types we talked about earlier, the object unwrappers, the exception marshalers, we can emit all of those as file scope types, or inline them directly in the generator if we wanted to. We could just inline everything, but we'd rather provide the building blocks to the ecosystem if we can.
Well, and you still need the thing that says, I want COM-based exception handling versus something else. So
yeah,
assuming that you want COM to not be the implied default.
Yes.
So
Well, for COM methods, we're only going to provide the COM-based exception handling. The other aspect of providing like the virtual method index attribute is if you put that on a method on a generated COM interface marked interface, then you can override whatever defaults you want, and we'll still slot it into the V table in the right spot. So if you, for some reason, have a COM interface where you want different exception behavior, like basically you're returning some sort of struct out of, instead of returning an H result, and then you want to have a custom instance returned, then you could use this attribute as the mechanism for specifying that. If you wanted to like use a custom string marshalling, I think currently the mechanism to provide that on the whole method would be through virtual method index. If you wanted a custom calling convention, that would be through this. There's a lot of like basically all the customizations that this attribute provides. This is currently our idea of the override mechanism for all of our defaults in the COM source generator. Of if you use this attribute, you could rip out, you can override whatever you want of the COM system.
So what I'm hearing is you want to cut this feature, right?
Aaron is not has never been enthused by this, but
I see.
We basically, as part of producing the COM source generator, we already built this entirely internally because this got us a good 70 to 80% of the way there on the COM interop, on the COM source generator. Like when we started bringing up the COM source generator, we copied all of this code and all of the stubs already worked.
So yeah, I don't know enough about the how ugly the end result is, but like I would say from a design principle, I like the idea that we're not tying ourselves once more to the ugliness that is Windows COM, right? Because I mean we have this problem that we don't really have a lot of interop today with non-Windows stuff besides pinvokes, right? So I think we have it effectively just for Android where we did a lot of the Java interop, but I don't know, that seems to me it's something that makes sense as an API, right? If that's part of this effort, then to me that would make sense. But Aaron, you want to say something?
Yeah, let me, and then tease ourselves is not needed. Yeah, like I
Aaron, you muted yourself.
Oh no, just to provide a little more clarity on that. I do think that there is value here, and I agree with you, Emo, that like the design helps us in a lot of ways to like frame it. I think the concern that I have is more along the lines of there's a lot of complexity here, and I don't know what V2, because there's going to be something that's going to come up in COM source generator that we don't have, and I don't want to tie ourselves into a public API that we have something that we really don't have a user for right now, and so I think getting over a lot of the API review and like, does the general design make sense? Sounds great. I would have a really hard time saying that this is justified in a .NET 8 timeframe, though. I can't find a practical or a functional use that we need it right now, as opposed to maybe .NET 9 or when we have a more compelling scenario. So I think that's kind of the only hesitation I have.
Yeah, we had a compelling scenario in MS Quick, and then they moved to using a Cling-Sharp based solution. So we lost the useful motivation in using it in the runtime itself. But we had one when I first opened the issue. And I guess there's a few places where we could use this, where we also have some delegate interop that we had to port over to using manual stubs that we converted from the library import source generator into using delegates.
I'm sorry for stealing your scenario.
Yeah.
So I mean, for the surface visibility things, I think if we add the SEH marshaller, so somebody can choose to use that if they want, and we call default void or something so that we don't give the impression that this is a piece that does magic for you, and then add failfast as an enum option. I think that the shape makes sense, given the constraints that have been shared. Certainly, Aaron, if you think it doesn't make sense for you guys to check it in, API approved doesn't mean must ship in the release.
Yeah, we can always, once it gets approved, we can always throw it onto future and just get to it when we get to it.
Yeah, like I'm not pushing back on the API review at all. I think that's completely reasonable. It's more of, this is incredibly complex. Is it going to potentially change? Yep. So I am not as confident as Jeremy is about, I think, that necessarily the current design. That's my only hesitation.
And then maybe dumb question, why does this not apply to the current, or to things that are not v-table-y? Like, why does the exception marshalling handling not apply to just generalized p invokes / reverse p invokes?
We don't have a source generation story for reverse p invokes at this time. We have an issue saying we should add said feature, but we have not built out that API and put it up for API review. That's on our backlog of, once we finish COM, we'll look at it for .NET 8, probably actually finish the implementation in .NET 9. And we'd probably take a similar approach for the exception marshalling.
Right,
would be my guess.
Because I was looking at it just as from the apparently reverse p invoke scenario of it. This seems like general infrastructure that should be applied to things, but if we're not fully supporting the reverse p invoke direction from the generator, even though I thought we were, because that's why we had the managed to unmanaged and unmanaged to managed things. But if
we've been building the infrastructure for it, we just haven't gotten to proposing the API for how to do it with delegates, because delegates are kind of weird, and we need to figure out a good story of like what's the right API shape to make this easy.
Fair enough. So yeah, I think that the general expression of how exception marshalling would work on a reverse p invoke seems legit.
So then we approve as is, we defer. What's the plan then?
Yeah, what do you want us to do, Aaron?
And of course, Aaron gets up and walks away like 30 seconds before this, because David came and grabbed him. I think
it's quite the power move. I have strong opinions on this. Let me walk out.
I think my guess, based on what he said, is approve, but we won't implement it right away. And then we might bring it back to API review in the future based on evolution in COM. Or we can put down the comments from this time, throw it milestone into future, come back to it when we come up on the schedule, or throw it onto API, like put in the comments, put it on API needs work, and come back later. And then we can decide when we come back, we could either just be like, no changes, we decided what we have here is good, or we could come back and say, based on experience with the COM source generator and other source generators, this is what we'd like.
I mean, that makes sense to me. I think we can do that. So then
So the 2 points that I don't see in your bullets, Emo, are the one that was called default should maybe be called void instead of default. And it seems like we're missing the SEH marshaller for Windows.
Yes, basically the SEH rethrow. Or SEH propagation.
Sorry, which one is the void one?
There was one proposed as like exception default handler, and it meant default as in it's going to fill the buffer with zeros instead of default as in it's doing a default set of behaviors.
Yes, that's basically the exception H result in the exception and exception default, changing that to exception as.
Yeah, that's
default.
What I thought, because I think the void one was the swallow one, right?
Yeah, and then void, and then swallow was void, so that was going to be exception as void.
Sure,
sort of thing.
So fair enough. So if we were inserting the as-is, then I don't know if you did that in line or should put that as a bullet.
I can do it both actually.
Yeah, put it. Yeah, it's however you want to put it. It's just so we don't forget.
And then swallow exception, that would be exception as void, Marshall.
Yes.
Okay. So that's what I have now. Exception as H result, exception as nan.
Yeah.
Exception.
And then and I'll fix the custom marshaller attributes on each of the types to have the correct names, because they basically the last type of points to the same name.
Ah.
But I can fix that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then somewhere the notion of the SEH
Get that one I added.
as a okay.
Yeah. So I'll switch to needs work in future, and we'll come back to this in the future.
Yep, let's do that.
You marked it as approved and needs work.
Yeah, I mean that seems reasonable, right? Actually,
Yeah, it's approved.
It's just
weird.
GitHub is weird.
Now it's ready for review.
I'll fix it right here.
Yeah, let me do it because the problem is otherwise the tool doesn't pick it up.
Okay, sorry.
So that is needs work, right? So this is the one we want.
Okay.
Because it's basically whoever does the change. Like basically the change plus the comment is taken together. If they don't align, then nothing will work.
Okay.
We'll see. We'll see what the tool does now. So are we then good for today? I think we are, right? We're at time.
Yeah, I was gonna say I have another meeting at the start of the hour, so I don't think we should do another.
Sounds good. Then I see the rest of you on Thursday, I guess.
Yeah. Hey, we got an interop source generation related issue reviewed in under 2 hours. That's a record.
That's true. Although it could have been 5 minutes, as in we don't do it today. All right. See you guys. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.